it's all a risk. Having a child is a risk. Not having a child is a risk. Life is a risk. But you follow your gut. You follow your heart. And know that you'll make the right choice.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Today's conversation feels extra special to me personally because the woman you are about to meet is who I would venture to say quickly becoming my child-free idol. I came to meet Maria through Instagram a few months ago when she reached out to me and asked if she could send me the advanced copy of her latest book called Instead, Navigating the Adventures of a Childfree Life. Of course, I said, yes, please send me the book. And I have to say this book just had me totally immersed in Maria's world. Maria is an internationally published and award-winning author of 13 books. She is an adventurer, she is a traveler, and she is child-free by choice. And to me, she really exemplifies what it means to fully embrace the possibilities that exist when we decide to be child-free. Now, Maria has also written extensively about her worldwide travels and expeditions that she has taken with her husband, Dag Goering, who is a veterinarian and photographer. The two of them together have founded a boutique adventure travel company called Hidden Places, as well as its conservation branch, Adventures for a Cause, raising funds and awareness for endangered species. Maria has a very interesting international life. She is an expat like myself. She actually splits her time between Catalonia and the west coast of Canada. So we're sort of like ships of the night because I have moved from west coast of Canada to Europe, and she's originally actually from the UK. So without further ado, please buckle up for this conversation and meet Maria Coffey. Maria, thank you so much for being here. I have to say that ever since we became acquaintances, online friends, I was so enthusiastic and excited to meet you and talk to you. And then I read your beautiful new memoir Instead. And yeah, I'm kind of vibrating to have this conversation with you because you are the kind of person I aspire to be as far as the kind of life that you've led, the experiences that you've had. Of course, in a memoir, we just see kind of like that top level. I'm sure it must have been very challenging for you to summarize all these things that have happened over the last 70 plus years of your life. But hopefully today we can get into at least some of it. And I just want to thank you for being here. I'm so excited to meet you. And I would love to start off if you could just tell our listeners a little bit about who Maria Coffey is. Who are you?
Who am I? Goodness, that's a big question.
Philosophical, perhaps.
Well, I'm an author. I also run an adventure travel business. In the past, I have been a teacher, a nanny, a burrito seller, a grape picker. I've done many different things during my life. But right now, my focus really is on writing because I have written, Instead is my 13th book. And I started writing in 1989, quite by accident. We'll probably get into that later. And many of my books have been about the worldwide adventures I've had with my husband, Dag Goering, because as well as all of the above, I hate to call myself an adventurer or an explorer because it sounds too big-headed, but we've had a very adventurous life. We've traveled the world. We've done a lot of wild expeditions by kayak, by bicycle, for months on end in remote places. And then quite a few of my books are about these journeys that we've had together. But I've also written about the mountaineering world because my partner before Doug, my husband, was a world-class mountaineer who died on Everest when I was 30. And that was a really defining moment of my life that led to me writing 3 books about the experience of living with a mountaineer, the emotional impact of mountaineering, and the spiritual aspects of extreme adventure. So I guess in a nutshell, that's me. And I'm 71 now, and I've always railed against the word retire. So I still feel like I spent a life reinventing myself, and I think I'm still doing that now.
Yeah. I was speaking with a child-free friend today, and I was saying those of us women who choose not to have kids, it's almost this feeling that we get to live many different lives. And I think there's something so beautiful and exciting about that. And I think it can be daunting for people as well, because there's so much possibility. There's so many different paths that we can walk. And I'm on the same page as you. This idea of retiring, it's like, retiring from what? All these things I enjoy and that like form who I am. So I have to say with your most recent book instead, it's actually the only book of yours I've read. However, so first of all, not only is this an incredible book about a beautiful, adventurous, to use that word again, adventure, child-free life, and not just a child-free life, just a really rich, wonderful, complex life. I mean, it's the ups, the downs. We're going to get into some of those things today, but it's not only one of the best books I've read about being child-free, but it's actually one of the best books I've read, period. And I'm an avid reader. Yeah, no, truly. Memoir is one of my favorite genres. And I was so captivated by this book. You are an exquisite writer. You are somebody who seems very connected to the human experience and soul, if you will, and the relationships that we have. And it certainly left me wanting to read and hear more about the experiences that you've had. Let's say this. I hear a lot of women say, and I'm on the one hand all about embracing simplicity in life. I like nothing more than sitting on the sofa with my dog and having a cup of coffee and reading a good book. But I do feel like there's sometimes this sort of like lack of imagination that people have, and maybe even in the child-free space in terms of like what our lives can look like. And to me, you really exemplify somebody who said like, how can I do an experience? We can't do it all, but as many different possible things in this life. And so for me, it's really an example of possibility. Again, there's nothing wrong with residing in what we know and the simple and the mundane, because I think there's beauty to be found in that. But you certainly had me wanting to go and do it and be an experience more. So I'm going to stop fangirling now and allow you to tell more about yourself.
Thank you.
But I just want to say, if please do yourself a favor, whether you are strongly considering not having kids, whether you're already child-free, whether you're considering being a mother, maybe you're a parent listening, pick up Maria's book instead, or one of her other books, because she is a fantastic writer. This is not just the instance of a book that's been published because it's like tapping into this hot topic of being child-free. Okay, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what readers can expect to find inside of Instead and what this book is all about.
Well, maybe I'll explain how it came about. I had a long break from writing. My last book had been published way back in 2008. And then I decided to really focus on our adventure travel business. And that completely consumed me and of course, Dag as well, my husband, because we were just traveling the world, really busy. And then in around, I don't know, the beginning of 2018 or something, I really had an urge to write again. And the reason was because I had suddenly become freaked out about the approach of old age. I was in my 60s and heading towards my 70s. And it was something that I'd been in denial about for a long time. I'd always looked a lot younger than my years until I turned 60. At my 60th birthday party, people were amazed I was 60. But that began to change pretty quickly over the next few years. So I suddenly found myself looking ahead into old age, and it felt like this unknown territory that was really frightening. I didn't know how to advance into it. I didn't know how to deal with it. And so I did what I've often done in my life to help me through difficult things. I've written about them. And so I began to write about this, and I began to look back at other experiences in my life that had been very hard, very challenging, and how I dealt with those, what lessons I'd learned during those periods. And if I could use those lessons into heading into this new adventure of old age. So I began writing. I began the book properly at the end of 2019 on a writing residency in Canada. And I found that when I was about 4 chapters in, I realized that I constantly kept coming back to the fact that I had chosen not to have children. And I realized that this was, in a way, the big question that I needed to be writing about, and that becoming old was only just one part of that story. And so I changed the focus of the book, and I began to write about why I chose to be child-free, the roots of that choice, going back to my Catholic upbringing, my mother, the loss, the bereavement I suffered when I was 30, a near-death experience I had when I was 21, and also during all that formative period of my life, the the intense desire that was growing in me to have an unusual life. Even when I was a kid, I wanted to be wandering the world. When I grew up, that's what I wanted to do. So the book began to be an exploration of my life through that lens of the decision to be child-free. And interestingly enough, at the end of the book, I came back to the very question I started with about how does it feel now, heading into old age and being child-free. So it's a big span of a book. It spans a whole life, and obviously I don't tell every story, every experience.
Yeah.
but the thread holding it all together is that choice to not become a mother, and how that impacted me and others, and what it's brought me. Things that I feel I might have lost, etc., etc. I realized also as I was writing it, that the subject of being child-free was becoming more and more prominent on social media, etc. And I realized that there weren't many women or people who were giving the long view of looking back at a life. Like, what is it like now when you're older? And I thought, well, this might be valuable. So I kept going.
Yeah. And I think I know it certainly is, because while I think it's fantastic that there are more vocal voices about the experience of being child-free, and I would offer those are sometimes still perhaps a bit limited in perspective, I do think, like you say, taking this long view, looking back over your life, which, I mean, you're still in the midst of. Certainly, I'll be really interested to continue, staying in contact with you and seeing how things evolve over the coming years. But it's certainly a different perspective to offer than somebody who may be, let's say, 32 years old saying, hey, child-free and loving it. It's just different. You've lived more life, and getting towards the end of, at least my mother just turned 70, and she's like, even if I live for, call it another 30 years, I'm like 2/3 through my life. It is a different perspective. And I think it's one that's so important for us to explore. And I also believe that, I don't know if solace is the right word, but I think it can offer a lot, specifically to those who are on the fence and who are undecided. Because one of the biggest things that I hear in my work, talking to people who are unsure, is not about now. It's about what's life going to look like later. So I look forward to talking about as many of these different things as we can cover in our time together. Now, I just want to mention one more thing that you said, looking at sort of what are these different influences that have played into this decision. And ultimately, we are all of our decisions are a byproduct of who we are, how we've been raised, the narratives we've been exposed to. And I imagine, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about this, it's probably a bit tough to disentangle and to figure out, okay, what made me how I am? But I want to ask, first of all, how did you arrive at this decision to stay child-free or to not have kids? And was this something was it a decision, or was it something you just simply always knew?
It wasn't something that I always knew. It was something that I guess I grew into, that was a gradual process. I mentioned before, I was brought up in a pretty strict Irish Catholic family, and I was sent to a convent school, a day school. And it was just growing up, especially in the 50s, it was just presumed that as a young woman, you went to school, hopefully you went to university, and then you got married and you had children. That was just a given. And my parents came from a pretty poor background in Ireland. They emigrated to England just before the Second World War. And they put everything into their children. They had 3 children. I was the only daughter and the youngest child. They worked so hard to give us everything they'd never had. For my mother, that included a big white wedding. She got married just before the war and had hardly any money. So from the time I was about 7, she started saving for my wedding. She would tell me about this amazing white wedding I was going to have. It'd been the best wedding that Paris would have ever seen. And she would also talk about how I'd then settle down close by to her, live very close by, so that my children could run in and out of a house and she could babysit them when I was working. So, I had this real sort of intense pressure on me, this expectation, because it was clear that was what my mother, wanted more than anything else, was for me to give her grandchildren. And she often said to me, seeing a daughter become a mother is the most wonderful thing in the world. Yeah. And unfortunately, as that was happening, as I said before, my dreams were developing in a very different direction. I just knew, even when I was very small, and my favorite book was Alice in Wonderland. And I wanted to be Alice. I wanted to be going to all these really wild, bizarre places. And I wanted life to be surprising and shocking. And as I got into my teens, those early sort of dreaming longings developed into something much more concrete. And I knew I wanted to travel. And I started traveling as soon as I could. My first university long summer holiday, I took off and hitchhiked across Europe to the Greek islands and slept on Greek beaches and had a wonderful time. And so, that was, as I headed into my 20s, I wasn't really interested in getting married. I wasn't thinking about having children. I then fell in love with a mountaineer we were together for 3 years. He was away 50% of that time climbing very serious mountains, K2, Everest, big mountain in China, etc., on very difficult routes without oxygen. And on his final expedition was in 1982 to the northeast ridge of Everest, and he and his climbing partner disappeared on that close to the summit, and they were lost without trace. And so at 30 years old, suddenly my life was blown apart by that. And oddly enough, that was the only time up to then that I even considered maybe having a child. I used to have sort of a couple of fantasies about being pregnant with his baby, but I think that was more because I knew there was a risk that he would die. And I think it was more kind of wanting a little piece of him if he did, He was lost without trace. I was absolutely devastated. And I think it was then that I really began to realize that motherhood was not for me, because his loss was so hard for me. I kept thinking, if it's like this to lose a person, a partner, what would it be like to lose a child? And I developed a pretty big fear of loss and the loss of separation. So scroll forward about 3 more years, I met my present husband, Dag, and I'd moved across the world to Canada to start a new life. I met him. We fell in love. When we met, I was 33 or 34. He was 29. He told me pretty early on in the relationship that he always imagined children in his future, but that he didn't, like me, he wanted an adventurous life, but he didn't want to start having children till he was at least in his 40s. After he'd had some big adventures. And of course, if you do the math, that just wouldn't have worked out. So that was early on in the relationship. I told him that I wasn't really interested in having kids, but as we fell in love, as we began creating a life together and starting to plan some very big adventures together, we planned to go on a around the world year-long trip with a folding kayak and kayak for months on end in some very remote places. At that time, he was still suggesting that we should have a child. One child, he scrolled it down to, but he felt that we could have a child and still pursue this adventurous life and take the child along. And I knew that would not be, it might have been physically possible for me, but not emotionally, because I knew that my fear of loss, my anxieties would just not, and I just couldn't do that. I would just be a mess the whole time. And I wasn't sure it would be fair to the child either. So for me, it was either one path or the other. Pursue this adventurous, open-ended existence. We were giving up our jobs. We had very little security. Pursue that or settle down and have a child. And I decided that I think that's when I made the decision. I didn't want to have children. I didn't want the kind of settled life I felt I would have to have if I had a child.
Did you feel like he gave you the space to make that decision, or what was his reaction to that? And did you feel like you were going to be taking something away from him if he wanted to? I mean, that's kind of a terrible way of putting it, but I think we sometimes feel like, well, what's this now going to mean for my partner?
It's an interesting question. I mean, it was kind of a process over a few years. I mean, in a way, it was difficult for me because I knew that he would be a fantastic dad. I saw him with little kids of friends of ours, and they were always drawn to him like a magnet, and the way he played with them, the way he encouraged them to do things they would never have dared to do. He'd take them fishing, they'd be climbing trees with him. Kids just always had and still have great fun around him. So that was always a thought at the back of my mind. But we had some, in the book, I tell the story of one epic fight that we had after we'd spent 3 weeks kayaking in some desert, literally desert islands in the Sea of Cortez off the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. And we had got pinned down by winds. We'd been stranded on this tiny little island for days. We were running out of food and water. Seriously running out of food and water. There was huge sandstorms. There was no shade. It was a pretty awful situation. One morning we made a break for it. There were huge seas, but we made a break for it. And we were almost at land, almost at safety, when Doug said how much he was sad that this trip was over and he couldn't wait to be out out again in more wild places for longer periods. And then he said, I've been thinking we could easily have a kid along on a trip like this. And I won't go on record. I do write in the book about what I said to him. I was really shocked and horrified. And I was like, it's absolutely not possible. How could we have a child along this, no food, no water, searing winds, no shade? And he said, that's fine. You could breastfeed it, and a massive row ensued while we were still paddling against the wind and the waves. After that, we decided to call a truce, and because we were then making plans to go off on this year-long worldwide trip with a folding kayak. And he said, let's wait until the end of that trip and then make the decision. And at which point I was 40. I would have been 40 at the end of that. And so that's what happened. So it was sort of still in the air during that trip, and a number of things happened. I think he realized that some of the wild things we did, we could not have done with a child. But right at the end of the trip, we were in Munich and we went to visit some friends who he had always held up as his model of, they like us were going off on doing long expeditions, and they were also planning to have a child. And they told Doug that they would bring their child along. And so he sort of held them up as, these are people, who are not going to let it stop them change their life in any way. Well, we went to visit them when they had an 11-year-old son, and they hadn't, I don't think they'd left Munich since they'd had the baby. And it was a completely baby-centered domestic scene. We couldn't even have a conversation with them, because the baby was crying, I had to be put to bed, or we were talking about the baby. And I think I watched Doug during that evening, just like reality sinking in, and I think from that point on, he came around very quickly to agreeing with me. And it took some time, but eventually he made the decision for himself.
Yeah. I want to highlight that it did take time. And I think a lot of people assume when they come to this decision that it's something that happens day to day, where it's like, okay, now I know. And certainly there are people who have always that innate knowing and it's very clear to them. For a lot of us, though, it is a process. And I know for myself, it wasn't like I can think about one pinpointed moment in time where I was suddenly, struck by lightning. And it's like, okay, now I know I don't want to have kids. It is an evolution. And I think specifically in partnership, although it sounds like he gave you that space. And I think it's also important, that we have to make these decisions in and of ourselves, that it was an ongoing conversation that the two of you were having. I mean, this book it's a love story of many sorts. It's about romantic love. It's about maternal and familial love. It's about love of life. And the two of you seem to have a very beautiful relationship. And I'm interested to ask you a couple of things about that, because I relate to this sort of fear of loss and vulnerability. And I think for me as well, it probably stems a lot from past traumatic experiences that I've had. Do you also have that sense? And I know for me, it was sometimes with my husband, Chris, am I pinning all my hopes on this one person versus them potentially having, children or a bigger extended family? Have you had those fears with him? And is it something that you've come to some resolution with? Or is it this is just the price we pay for love?
Yes.
I think there were 5 questions in there.
Yeah. I mean, we are really joined at the hip. We're each other's best friend, best travel companion. We've been married for, I've lost count, 36 years or something. I've never been bored for a minute. He's an amazing guy, and we've shared so much, and we're still sharing so much, and we're still cooking up crazy plans, and we just have the best life together. And it terrifies me to think, well, he did have a very bad accident. I begin the book actually with a story of a very bad accident he had here in Catalonia when I thought I might lose him then. And I think he used the word price to pay. Yeah. It's like, obviously either we go together or one of us goes, and it's going to be, if it's the latter, it's going to be absolutely horrific. But wow, what a life we've had. I wouldn't have. And maybe, I think the thing about, children being some sort of a guarantee against that. I remember when my father died, and watching my mother fall apart, and I had, as children, you don't kind of understand the love between your parents, and seeing her absolute grief and realizing, wow, nothing could console her, even though she had all her children around her at that time. So, yeah, I think there is always obviously a great price to pay for great love, and that's grief in the end, I guess. But wow, it's it's worth it.
Let's talk a little bit about your mom. Now, Irish Catholic upbringing, a lot of pressure there. It's interesting because I think when our parents, they've created a life for us to be able to have choice, to be empowered, especially as women. Sometimes then we go the opposite way, right? It's like, well, thank you for this. And I know for me, I mean, my mom probably made choices or lived a life that I've then run counter to. And I wonder, certainly, I guess just tell me a little bit about how this kind of went down with your mom, because I can imagine it was very difficult in a sense to feel like you were disappointing her. And this is something that I hear from a lot of women is they say, I feel so guilty that I might not give my mom or my parents grandchildren. I feel so badly to know that I may not fulfill their wish of what for them was the greatest experience. So how did you contend with that? And how did that impact your relationship with your mom?
Well, I had a very contentious relationship with her. I mean, in the book, I said, I write that the only joke I can ever remember is how many Irish Catholic mothers does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, none. They'd rather sit in the dark and suffer. And that was my mom. She was very loving, supportive, funny, generous. She was a larger than life woman, but she was a real matriarch, and she wielded guilt like a weapon. And boy, did I suffer from that. As I said earlier, she set up so many expectations for me early on, and I broke them one after the other. I did become a teacher, but I very quickly gave my first job up to go traveling in South America for a year. I didn't get married straight away. I, clearly wasn't that interested in having children. And then I fell in love with a mountaineer, and she was horrified by that. And then when he died, I moved to the other side of the world and gave up my teaching career entirely and started traveling. And clearly, then she realized that even though I'd fallen in love with somebody, that I was not going to have children. So it was like one disappointment after another. And she was always very happy. I think particularly after Joe died on Everest, to see a child suffer, I realized then is terrible for a parent. And, that hurt her so badly to see me so devastated. So to see me happy again was wonderful for her. So that kind of eased the pressure a little bit. But one of the first questions she asked me when I told her about Dag was, does he want children? And actually, I never told her that he did. I didn't. I just kind of, for what I said, I think I just ignored it. So yeah, it was difficult for her. And again, it was a gradual realization for her, because I think she always hoped I would have a child. And because she kind of knew that Doug was interested in having children, and she and his mother became good friends. When she visited Canada, she got to know his mother, and they would get together in a little huddle and talk about these two would make lovely parents, etc. And I think she always had that hope, and then obviously eventually realized it wasn't going to happen. When I was in my early 40s, I confronted her about the guilt, and we had a massive blow up, and it actually changed everything. It was like lancing a boil and letting the poison drain away. Our relationship became, I put all my cards on the table, and so did she. And we reached an understanding, and it was wonderful because she lived for 19 more years, and we became the best of friends. But when she was dying, we had a very poignant conversation. She was very healthy till she was 92. She got terminal cancer suddenly, or we found out about it suddenly. She went into a nursing home. I moved back to England for some months and was with her every day until the very end. And about a week before she died, one morning I was sitting next to her bed, and out of the blue, she said to me, "Can I ask you something? Have you ever regretted not having children?" And I was really taken aback because it was a long time since we talked about the subject of children, me having children. Obviously, by then I was 59 years old. Before I answered her, I had this sudden realization that for her, me having a child would have totally completed something. It would have completed the circle of motherhood for her to see her own daughter have a child. And she would have passed on not only genes, but so much knowledge, and so much understanding. And I suddenly realized that I was actually painfully sorry that I hadn't given her that, but that I knew I just couldn't have given her that because I wasn't prepared to sacrifice my dreams for her. And I decided not to explain all that to her. I just said, "No, Mama, I've never regretted it. I'm really happy." And she looked so relieved. And she said, I'm so glad. I've always worried about it. So it was a very, and then she said, "I just need to sleep for a little bit now." And she went to sleep for a while.
Yeah.
So
a beautiful story, how you share that relationship and how it unfolds. And it certainly sounds like it was a very challenging relationship, but also I love the closeness that you came to, especially after, as you say, laying all the cards on the table and having that hard conversation. And I do think that, for the most part, our parents want us to be happy. And I think sometimes this pressure they can exert on whatever it may be, whether it's having kids, whether it's a certain career path, whether it's living somewhere, it's like they just want what they see or perceive to be best for us. But of course, it's up to us to determine what that is. And it can be, difficult.
I'd like to tell you one little story, something that happened in Banff recently. I went to the Banff Mountain Film and Book Festival and I gave a presentation about Instead. I gave a talk for 35 minutes and then there were questions. And after the event, I was having coffee or drinks with some people in the bar. And this gentleman approached me, very well dressed. I'd say he was in his 50s maybe. And he said, "I was at your presentation and I want to tell you that today you've changed our family's life." And he told me that he was in the audience with his wife, and elsewhere in the auditorium was his daughter. And he said his daughter was 28, their son was 32. Neither of them had shown any interest in having children, even though they were both married. And he and his wife had been putting enormous pressure on them to have children. And he said, to the extent that we've said that whichever one has a child first gets 10% more of the inheritance. I don't know if he was joking or not. And he gestured over to his wife and she was sitting there and she looked really emotional. He said, "Halfway through your talk, I texted my daughter and I said, the pressure's off. And you made us realize that we've been doing the wrong thing and it's their life and their decision." And I have to say it was a really important moment for me. It was like, this is, when your book's made a difference in someone's life like that, it's very special.
Yeah. Wow. How incredible. And I want to highlight, I know the book went on to win a big award. Can you tell us just briefly, that was at the same festival? Yeah,
it won the Adventured Travel Award, which I was very pleased about.
It's wonderful. Amazing. Well, if my testament's not enough, allow that to be. All right, I have a very important invitation to make, and that is to join us for one of our upcoming Kids or Child-Free workshops. If you have not attended one of these 2-hour workshops and you are unsure whether you should have kids or stay child-free, this is the next thing on your to-do list to getting clear on the right choice for you. Head to kidsorchildfree.com. I will also link to our workshop page in the show notes and get all the details on this 2-hour live online workshop that's going to help you get more clarity and direction in terms of whether a future with kids or a future without them is the right path for you. Tickets are only $45 and we have these workshops every month or two, so you should be able to find a date and time that works for you. If you can't join the upcoming date, make sure you sign up for emails so that you can get notified when the next date is announced. All right, let's see here. So we've talked a little bit about some of the travel and adventure that you've done, and something we hear from a lot of parents, especially in comment sections of child-free people on the internet, which highly advise not checking those out. The comment sections, it can be a bit of a landmine, but is that people can do the exact same things if they have kids as if they don't have kids. And, I would argue it really depends on what you like to do, what your life looks like. I mean, if your idea of a vacation is going to a all-inclusive beach resort in Mexico, yes, perhaps you can do that with your children. But I mean, I guess you sort of answered my question already, but would you say the life that you lived would not have been a possibility if you had kids? Would you agree with that? Or do you think that you could have had some semblance of what you've done if you had children?
No. Like I said before, emotionally, I couldn't have done it. I think even physically. I mean, we've done things like kayak the length of Lake Malawi for 6 weeks with hippos and crocodiles around and, living in very rough conditions. And we've traveled the length of the Vietnamese coast way back in the early 90s on local fishing boats, got arrested along the way. I mean, I couldn't have done that with children. I have friends who do adventurous things with children. I mean, I have friends who've gone on round the world sailing trips with their kids, but, I think that there are you have to have a certain temperament. And there is also a time, I think, where everything has to focus on the children in terms of their education. Do they have to go to school now, et cetera, so. But for me personally, no, I could not have had the life I wanted if I'd had children. Not to have the life I wanted. I'd always grown up wanting.
Yeah.
I knew that if I had children, it wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah. I'm curious, not having children, would you say it's afforded you other things in your life or other experiences or opportunities that you otherwise don't think you would have been able to have?
Well, yes. I mean, everything I've done, I wouldn't have had. And also, I grew up, I think one thing for me is that I've always dreaded routine. That's why I couldn't pursue a teaching career. I hated having a career where I knew every September how the rest of the year was going to pan out, and every day, was divided up into lessons and bells going off, and for me, routine is anathema. I kind of thought that having a child would be like that. Children need routine. I mean, everybody needs some routine in their lives, obviously, but I didn't want that kind of routine in my life. And so I think it would have, in a way, I'm sort of turning your question around a bit. In a way, it would have, I think I could have had a child, of course. I'm sure I would have enjoyed motherhood, but it wasn't the life that I wanted. I didn't want to be thinking about, I have to live this place so my kid can go to that school. I think what not having children has given Doug and I as well is a lot of lightness in our lives. We've always known, we're good at knowing what we don't want to do. We've never been good at long-term planning ever, but we're always very clear. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. And that has and we've stayed light on our feet in every way, that when opportunities have arisen to move to another country, to go on some sort of special adventure, let's say to start a adventure travel business like we did, that we can go, oh, okay, let's switch and do that.
Yeah.
Nothing is holding us down. We're not kind of pinned to one place and never have been, which I think if you have, or if I'd had children, I probably would have felt quite differently. So, and even at the age we are now, we still have that lightness. We're still, okay, we can live here, we can live there, we can travel to this place, we can do whatever we want, really, as long as, we have the means.
Yeah. I love the word that you used to describe that, lightness, because it has a few different connotations, I think, and you shine when you say it. And I also like that you say, yes, you could have enjoyed, and I'm sure found some fulfillment, perhaps, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that motherhood could have been a path, but it wouldn't have been those things you wanted. And it would have looked vastly different. And that sort of brings me to my next question, because I think when we make this decision and people hope when they find, quote unquote, the right choice, or they make a clear choice, let's say, that it's all just going to be good and whatever they've left behind would theoretically have been bad. And that there will be an ease in having decided, which, certainly there is an ease to having reached a decision. It's like, oh, okay, I don't have to think about this all the time anymore. And I'm sure for you and Dag, not having to have these sort of circular conversations was like, now we can look at the next part of our life. But that being said, I fully believe that there are going to be moments of challenge and struggle and ups and downs and tough emotions with whatever we choose. And so I'd love for you to speak a little bit. I mean, we've heard a lot about the beautiful things that Childfree Life has afforded you in your relationship and the travel, et cetera. But what have some of the struggles been? What's been hard for you about not having chosen to have kids?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Christmas has always been very hard for me. There are times of the year, and Christmas is definitely one of them, where I begin to feel, let me just bracket this. I've always felt like an outsider all my life, which is probably why I became a writer, because I think it's good to be an outsider. You feel like that and feel like you're looking in at things if you're an outsider. I've never been a good joiner of groups, etc. And there is often a sense that, Doug and I are very much a strong unit, and we've got friends all over the world. And, I've got family, in England and in Canada. But, we don't have that sort of strong family unit that so many people have. And at Christmas, I often go through a lot of self-doubt. I'm like, well, what is wrong with me? The lights and the jollity and the presents and everything. And I'm like, why haven't I done this? And obviously I'm looking in at something that, Christmas can be horrific for lots of people in lots of ways. There are times that I do sometimes feel like that. I sometimes wonder, like, oh, what's wrong with me? Why couldn't, why wasn't I able to create that? Or just feeling so outside it, sometimes difficult. And it's actually got less and less. I went through a period where it was I think after my mum died, particularly, I went through a period where it was very difficult. I remember we went to, one Christmas, we went to Sri Lanka, and I ended up spending the whole of Christmas Day curled up on bed. We were in this beautiful place on the beach, this little resort. And I was reading a book called Anil's Ghost, which is about the Civil War and a terrible dark novel about the Civil War in Sri Lanka. And I just spent the whole day crying. And, once Boxing Day had come and gone, I was absolutely fine. But yeah, it was
a memorable, jolly Christmas.
And then I guess we might get onto this later. Yeah, sometimes, I do get pangs, I love newborn babies.
Me too.
And I've often thought, well, I mean, and when I say this to friends who have had children, they absolutely scoff at me. I've often thought, well, giving birth must be one of the most profound experiences in life. And I've always wanted profound experiences. And, I'll say that to friends and they'll say, well, yeah, you can have my profound experience. Not having had that experience, not having had the experience of, holding a newborn baby for the first time. Those things, those are big experiences that I haven't had. And I'm not saying that I wish I'd had them, but yeah, sometimes there are little pangs. I have this thing about newborn babies and the smell of their heads. I love sniffing their heads. But so I have friends, again, younger friends who've got new kids, and they'll say, do you want to change the diaper now? And I'm like, no.
I'll take a pass. Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel much the same way. And I think it's also, it's sometimes people are surprised when I say that because I'm child-free by choice. And they're like, oh, what do you mean you like babies? Or you think that would be nice or interesting or profound? It's like, just because we've chosen a path doesn't mean that we necessarily hate or have rejected every single thing about that thing, right? I'm sure there's things about mothering and having kids that would be really, really neat and special. I likewise have a partner who I think would be an incredible father. And that's something that would, of course, be nice to witness and have, but everything else still holds more weight for me. So,
and there is also, I write at the beginning of the book when Doug had his terrible accident in 2020. And the first night I came back from the hospital, and I had this sudden, bizarre sense of wanting to reach out to somebody who was part of him and me, a child, which of course we didn't have. But again, I think that's similar to my experience when I was together with a mountaineer, thinking I'd quite like to get pregnant. I think that's more that's a reaction to trauma, rather than any big, long-term regret that you haven't done it. It's just one of those fleeting thoughts.
Okay, well, I'd love sort of as we move towards the end of this conversation to talk about some of these big topics that come onto the table when we think about having kids and specifically being child-free, and things like, fulfillment and meaning and legacy and loneliness and regret. So we've saved the best for last, maybe. These are the questions that are really, I think, weigh so heavily on people's minds. And so I'm curious for you in your own world, what does fulfillment look like for you? And would you say you've lived a fulfilled life thus far, knowing there's much to come?
Yes, I would. Yeah, because I have fulfilled my dreams that I had as a child and exceeded them massively. I mean, yeah, I definitely feel I have and still having a fulfilled life, because it's also been a life of great connection, because obviously that's something that family gives you. And maybe, in my case, I think because I didn't have children, it's, I've gone out into the world and I've got this, and made these incredible connections with people around the world. And for all our adventuring, for me, the most important part of it has been the people that we've met and the people that we've really connected with and often stayed close friends with. It's for me, it's all about getting under the skin of different countries, learning about the cultures and people and meeting people along the way. And so that's still happening. We're now spending several months each year in this little village in Catalonia and developing this beautiful little community here. And to your answer,
Yeah,
I do feel.
and I don't want to give it all away, but I know in the book you also talk about some of those family-like relationships, and specifically having children in your life, and sort of having become that mama figure. Can you speak to that just briefly? And again, knowing there's a lot more to share in the book, but have you had relationships like that?
Oh, yes. And in the book, I write about Agnes, who's I met her when she was almost 20-year-old. She's from a Samburu village, and we met her in the village when we were doing some elephant conservation work there, which is a whole other part of our life story that I hadn't mentioned before. My husband was a veterinarian, has done a lot of work with elephants. So we were introduced to this woman, and we found out that she had been a star pupil at the school in this remote village, and had been given a place at Nairobi University, which her father and some of the elders in the village had refused to let her go to university, refused to give her the funds, because since she was 12, she'd refused to undergo female genital mutilation, circumcision. This was their punishment. And the school teacher, a very enlightened man called Joseph, told us this story and said that Agnes's mother wanted her to go to university, and would we help her? So I tell the whole story in the book, but long story short, some months later, she started at Nairobi University, and we met her in 2011. She is now a barrister, and she has 2 children of her own. And maybe I won't give away.
Yeah.
Well, okay. She calls me Mala. And we're close.
How beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
How beautiful.
Yeah. And it was, for all the work that we've done, and we've done a lot of conservation work and work with different communities around the world. And I have to say, having been given the opportunity to help one young woman rise up to reach her dreams, and she's now out there helping other women. She's doing a lot of community work as well, to her work as a barrister. That, I think that's been one of the most fulfilling things I've done in my life.
Yeah.
To come back to your question about fulfillment.
Yeah. And I mean, you've done so many amazing things. And I find it always interesting that people talk about, personally, it's not about this idea of legacy and what am I leaving behind? Because for me, it's really about how am I impacting people right now, today, with my presence in this world. But it is something that you hear a lot, or people consider a lot when they think about having children, and their children themselves being their legacy. So I'm curious for you, is that something you've given, or perhaps as you've, aged, given more consideration to? And if so, what would you consider or hope your legacy to be?
I missed a little bit of that, but I think the question was about my legacy.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and if that's something that you care about, I mean, not to say we shouldn't, for me, it's not something that I give too much consideration to. I'm more about the here and the now versus the later, but.
Right. It is something that we thought about recently. So we do have a plan. Obviously, Agnes is part of that legacy, but we are setting up an organization. It's going to be an annual prize called Risking the Truth, which is a prize that we will fund, and that when we're eventually both shuffle off this mortal coil. We will, whatever we've got left, we'll leave to this prize. And it'll be initially an annual prize for a person somewhere in the risk everything, their life, their livelihood, their families, to tell a really important story. So it could be an environmentalist in the Amazon jungle fighting against some big oil company who's trying to, drill or cut down the Amazon forest. It could be somebody in a political situation. It could be one of the fixers that work for journalists, in war zones who really put their lives at risk to get these journalists to tell true stories. Yeah, so that's something that we're in the process of setting up now. We hope to be giving the first prize next year. And we're hoping it will also then grow into something else. But we both, I think because we've traveled so much and we've met so many people on the ground, particularly through our elephant conservation work, we've met, I'm thinking about some of the forest rangers in the Congo, who are there protecting elephants on the ground and are getting shot by people trying to poach them. And there are just so many people who are so brave, trying to protect their environment, trying to protect their democracies. They're just heroes that go unsung, and we'd like to raise them up in some way.
I think it's an incredible project, and you telling me about it, it's like full body goosebumps. I think, your legacy is all those things you've done. You've written incredible books, told incredible stories, you sharing about your instead life of not having kids, the conversation we're having today, elephant conservation work, the travel company. It's so multi-layered, and I really just look forward to everything that's to come and following your journey from here forward. I hope there's more books and we get to hear more about all of this. So I'd love, before we wrap up, Maria, I have just a few sort of rapid fire questions, if you will. The first couple are finish this sentence. So that is, being child-free is?
Your choice.
Yes. Being child-free is not?
Anybody else's choice.
I'm interested to know, what do you think one thing might be that could make this decision a little bit easier for people if they're really stuck and grappling?
More examples like mine.
Yeah, totally agree. I know that's been big for me. What's one thing you would like women who are moms to know? That
there's no divide between us. There should be no division between the child-free and and between mothers and non-mothers.
I agree.
Yeah, that's one thing that bothers me. And, I think there's room for all of us in this world, and we should all be in this together and support each other in our choices.
If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what might that be?
My advice would be, it's all a risk. Having a child is a risk. Not having a child is a risk. Life is a risk. But you follow your gut. You follow your heart. And know that you'll make the right choice.
I'd love, as we wrap this up, with you looking towards the future, and I realize there's so much we didn't have a chance to discuss today, so perhaps you'll join me again for a future conversation. But with you being 71 years old today, child-free, you mentioned there's so many projects in the works still, things that lie ahead. How are you feeling today about your choice and the future? And any parting words you want to share?
Well, I feel very solid in my choice. I think the future's always been sort of like open-ended for me. Obviously, I'm not quite sure what lies ahead. We've got some big adventures planned. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed I stay healthy. And I'm just very grateful to have reached this age and still being able to live this life and having a different kind of family around the world.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Is there a way that people can either keep up with the work that you're doing? Where can they buy your books? Is there anything you'd like to share on that front?
So my Instagram is @bookscoffee, not .com, just @bookscoffee. I'm in Facebook. I'm Maria Coffey. Our travel company website, and you can email me through that, is info@hiddenplaces.net. And the book is available. I think you can get it just about anywhere now via Kindle. It's available, I know, in Canada and in England. So I do hope you get to read it.
Again, the book is called Instead by Maria Coffey. Thank you again for being here today. And thank you everyone for listening. That concludes another episode of the Kids or Child Free podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's conversation. Now, if you have not already done so, first of all, I want you to give us a follow over on Instagram. Our handle is @KidsOrChildFree. Otherwise, I will link to that in the show notes. And what I would love for you to do is to slide on into my DMs and let me know, who would you like to hear on the podcast as an upcoming guest? This can either be someone in particular that you would love for me to have a conversation with, or maybe it's a certain type of guest. There's somebody in particular that you are wanting to hear from. Whether that be, hey, Keltie, I want to hear from somebody who had kids later in life, or I want to hear from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma, or whatever it may be. Let me know who you want to hear from, who would be an ideal guest, and I will do my very best to get them onto the podcast for a future episode.